Hello, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jay, and I'm a naval historian, but right now I'm kind of shifting just slightly to being maritime historian this month. And this is part three of the series in which I'm presenting the story of the Titanic to you with my analysis, interpretations, and how I would present this story to class. Um, when we left off the Titanic's stern section had finally disappeared beneath the waves, and the survivors were just floating around in their lifeboats. It's just this one scene here. This is famously lifeboat number four. This was one, if you've seen Titanic, the scene with John Jacob Astor placing his wife into a lifeboat and getting lifeboat number so he can potentially return to his family. Well, this is the lifeboat that it was. She was also This lifeboat was also one of the ones that ended up rescuing quite a large number of folks out of the ocean, and was also one of the lifeboats that helped get everyone off of the collapsible B, which was deployed upside down, and they were never able to write it. But that's also uh, the collapsible that Second Officer Charles Lightoller was on after he was swept away from Titanic. Here is also a photograph of a collapsible. I believe this was collapsible C, which did, as you see, did get deployed correctly. And so they did risk. After going through within half an hour, anyone who was going to be plucked out of the water that was washed off Titanic and was not originally in a lifeboat was in a lifeboat by this time. Hypothermia kind of quick kicks in pretty good, and if you're not rescued within, ideally, if you're not out of the water within 5-10 minutes, you're probably not going to make it. In fact, it took about half hour. Just tells you how thick the clothing was at that time, especially compared with modern clothing. And with that, they floated around for a couple hours until, shown here, the steamship Carpathia arrived. She heard the call for help, and even though she wasn't the closest ship, she was the first one to arrive on scene, and she picked up all the passengers. And then I should let you know she was actually on an eastbound voyage when she picked up the passengers, but once she did, she knew she didn't have then Captain Roston, shown here receiving a trophy from the surviving Titanic survivors from the unsinkable Molly Brown. Um, Opted he had more than enough supplies to make it back to New York, and that was also the closest major port of call in which what they could take all these folks. And I should say that the Titanic museums in Branson, Missouri, as well as Pigeonport, Tennessee, they do have a lot of artifacts uh, were found in the flotsam and taken off of survivors or unfortunate the folks who they passed away from hypothermia and were floating around that were uh, picked up by a bunch of ships that were sent out to rescue as many or find as many bodies as possible and also recover any wreckage. So I do highly recommend going to those places, especially if you're in Branson. That's the one I visited because sometimes, even though you're in the Ozarks, it still gets a bit hot and muggy during the summer, and if it's a really hot day, that's going to Titanic Museum is a lot better than sweating it out at Silver Dollar City. Um, with that, once Carpathia got back to New York City, the United States Senate wanted to take a look at this as uh, International Mercantile Marine uh, was the holding company that owned White Star Line, and International Mercantile Marine was an American company. Uh, Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan was like, oh, we should look into it. And we also should do this as fast as possible so that the memories were as fresh as possible. Um, the British did oppose it, but it did. Uh, it The conclusions ended up being very similar to what would eventually happen with the British Board of Inquiry by the British Inquiry by the Board of Trade, which was led by Lord Mersey in one of his final duties. Um, it was actually intended to minimize the influence of Board of Trade rules at that time, but it eventually found that there were a lot of problems with the way things were ran. Um, and also, let you know, this is between these two inquiries. This was also the first time that uh, it was mentioned that Titanic went down in two pieces rather than a single piece. This is from class passenger Jack Thayer's drawings, just within days of the sinking in his recollection. And what's interesting to note is in the upper right, he shows that Titanic did break in half. Now, this conclusion was rejected by both the American and the British inquiries, as they believed that that was impossible um, for a ship to go down, to break up and go down in multiple pieces like that. Secondly, there was a lot of discussion about Californian, uh, another steamer that was anchored or had stopped right before the ice pack, anywhere from 10 to 15 nautical miles north of what Titanic's position that she reported to uh, when she sent out the famous SOS calls. There was a lot of discussion of whether Californian's Captain Stanley Lord should have been alerted and sent out to uh, rescue Titanic and try to save more lives. But then comes the issue where there was a discrepancy in the testimony between Titanic's officers and crew and what Stanley Lord said about the color of the rockets. And the hypothesis that is right now, and really there's been no way to debunk, is that uh, Carpathian may have actually been closer to 20 nautical miles away from Titanic at that time, and uh, the rockets that Carpathia has seen, may being one color, may have actually been from an illegal whaling operation that was happening roughly halfway between Titanic's location and Carpathia's location. And so that color discrepancy meant that Carpathia never saw Titanic's rockets as they were beyond the horizon. They just saw that illegal whaler. And of course, that whaler did not respond to Titanic as it was an illegal operation. And had they gone to do any sort of rescue, once they got into port, they would have been arrested and sent to jail for that illegal operations. Um, with that all said, eventually both the inquiries found that International Mercantile Marine, White Star, nor Captain Smith were directly at fault, as much as they tried to pin as much of it on Captain Smith as they could. Is the issue was they were just following the standard practices at the time, and Titanic was not just in compliance, but beyond compliance with British Board of Trade construction and safety rules and guidelines on to uh, how many lifeboats were needed. So British Board of Trade kind of downplayed that part, and instead they between British Board of Trade's inquiry and the American inquiry, there were new rules and guidelines set up for construction of ocean liners and the reporting of service of icebergs. Watertight compartments now had to extend to the highest deck of the vessel at that point along the hull. Ocean-going ships were required to have the capacity of lifeboats at least match the rated number of passengers and crews for that vessel. It was okay if you put more on because you never know. The big one is the International Ice Patrol was established to track icebergs, and not just in the North Atlantic, but in all oceans. And the lead agency for that is United States Coast Guard, as you can see in this photo of a C-130 Hercules aircraft patrolling the seas looking for icebergs. Finally, I should let you know that sinking of Titanic and them having in White Star, as long as the rest of International Mercantile Marine, to they lost a lot of money on this, and they also had to redesign all their upcoming ships and current ships to hold more lifeboats. Uh, Even worse for White Star International Mercantile Marine was the Second World War, in which they could have, or not Second World, First World War, in which their ships were requisitioned to be troop carriers or hospital ships. And as part of that, well, Olympic did survive. Britannic, which was heavily modified and her launching was delayed uh, to right before the start of the Great War, she was converted into a hospital ship and eventually she was unfortunately lost in 1916 when she hit a naval mine off the coast of Croatia, and so she went down. So after First World War, after not making money through any of their uh, subsidiaries for 4 years, they also lost one of their three largest ships, and so there was only one Olympic class ship left. So as much as International Mercantile Marine and White Star tried to uh, get out of that financial hole, they eventually had to fold and were sold to what became the United States line in the early 1930s. And of course, as we know, that line eventually failed. Um, it's after the Second World War with the rise of jetliners taking the North Atlantic passenger, as that was just quicker to get uh, fly a plane from New York to London or vice versa than it was to take an ocean liner. Well, with that said, that's all I have for this week. Please join us next week, in which this actually gets a little crazy, and we will be discussing how Titanic was, the wreck site was eventually found, and what has happened at that site since, and just get you up to modern days. And so, with that, if you like this, please, of course, share this so you think would find this interesting. Also, subscribe if you haven't. And finally, if you're going to leave a comment, please be kind and respectful to everyone. And until next time, I will see you later. Bye bye.